podcast.
We like and welcome to the Wibbly Wobbly Timey Wimey podcast. We like comics because they have no bones, where the comics are bigger on the inside and you've redecorated, and I don't like it. I'm Joe Getcho.
And I'm Mike White, and this is a clean comic book podcast where we discuss and review comics by DC, Marvel, Image, Dark Horse, IDW, and today Titan Comics. You can find us on social media at Boneless Comics 1 on Twitter and at Boneless Comics Podcast pretty much everywhere else.
That's right. And before the Weeping Angels get you, make sure you check out our website at bonelesscomicspodcast.com with more information about the podcast, links to places to listen to previous episodes, and a link to our YouTube channel where you can watch video episodes and find additional bonus content like fun videos where I get to talk to the 10th Doctor.
Really? That should be fascinating for me to watch. I haven't seen that. Today, if you haven't already figured it out, we're going to be talking about Doctor Who, specifically the 10th Doctor, the Weeping Angels of Mons, which collects issues number 6 through 9 of Doctor Who, the 10th Doctor, published in 2014 to 2015 by Titan Comics, which, as far as I can tell, is a UK publisher. Written by Robbie Morrison and penciled by Daniel Indro.
Yeah. All right. So let's get into it. So Robbie Morrison is a Scottish comic book writer who got his start writing various spin-off stories for Judge Dredd. There's that again. I think a lot of them have, that we've reviewed have been involved with Judge Dredd lately. But it was called Judge Dredd the Megazine, which is a play on words formed from magazine and Judge Dredd's locale, Mega City 1.
Yeah.
So Robbie Morrison worked for Marvel in the early 2000s on Spider-Man's Tangled Web, which focused on characters connected to Spider-Man rather than focusing on the character himself. And the creative teams were given considerable leeway in terms of how strongly they adhered to continuity. So
that actually seems awesome.
Kind of out there. Yeah. He also wrote for The Authority for Wildstorm and Batman Gotham Knights number 59, Fire and Ice for DC. And he also wrote Deus Ex Human Revolution, which tied into the video game from 2011.
I think you played that, didn't you?
I did. The game, not the tie-in comic.
Yeah, I remember you going through that game, so that might be interesting for us to look at some point.
It was fun. So today we're focused on Morrison's 10th Doctor story featuring the Weeping Angels, but he's actually more known for his ongoing series from 2014 through 2017 featuring the 12th Doctor, who was played on TV by Peter Capaldi. So we're going to give you a little synopsis of, the Doctor and kind of, the key players in this story. But if you want to know about Doctor Who, there's been technically on screen 14 iterations, although you could argue that number a little bit. It's very complicated. So we'll just kind of talk about that probably in the after show. But as far as the writer goes, his writing I found to be pretty true to the character and the tone of the show. So we'll talk about, the story later, but that's kind of my impressions of him as a writer.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. Just kind of surface level, like it seemed like the Doctor's voice at least was spot on for specifically the David Tennant iteration. So our penciler today is Daniel Indro, who is an Indonesian comic book artist whose works in penciling and inking are primarily for Dynamite Comics in the US and various iterations of Doctor Who published by UK-based publisher Titan Comics. So there you go. Besides Doctor Who, he's also worked on the Warhammer 40,000 title Dawn of War 3, as well as Vikings Uprising, and those are both for Titan Comics as well. For Dynamite, his work is mainly for the 2011 comic continuing the adventures of Flash Gordon, a sci-fi character created to compete with the classic sci-fi hero Buck Rogers. So I guess Dynamite got the license to that character at some point.
Not Duck
Flash
Rogers.
Gordon was just a little bit before my time, so I don't know anything about it except that he's a guy with like a ray gun. I don't know. And that's basically all I could find out about Daniel Indro, because that must be like the John Smith name of Indonesia or something, because I got like 10,000 results when I typed that name in. And they were everything from like doctors to lawyers to all of that. And I could not dig through it to find like the comic artist or anything about his life or anything. So, what did you think of his art before we go on to the character overview?
Yeah, so I found the art kind of inconsistent at times, like the facial expressions, and it's always hard when you're drawing characters that have been seen on TV or in a movie. Like, we know what they look like, we know what they look like in various poses, and we've talked before about, I think in, what was it, Star Trek The Next Generation Hive, where they basically took camera stills from the show or movie and they kind of like traced those or drew those. And so it's like, you know, how do you as an artist decide, do I want to make this look like the actor or do I want to make it look completely different? I mean, that's a whole nother topic, but for this particular comic, it's almost like you couldn't decide which way to do it, because sometimes you really look like Tennant and sometimes you look like almost a different character in like different poses and different directions that he was looking, and it was really strange to me.
So what I found to be the case, just looking at it, and then this was kind of confirmed by looking at the rest of his work that he had done, was that he's a really good fit for a war comic. He was doing really heavy shadow, a lot of rain and like particles, you know, when bombs went off, and mud and grit and things like that. That fit very well for the tone of the time period that this story is going to be in. Unfortunately, as far as like drawing the Doctor himself, he felt really out of place. Like more so than just like, oh, he's a character that isn't from this time. Like, yeah, he's going to look like he's out of place.
An alien.
He just, it was like he was trying to almost go more cartoony with him, because that iteration is so like animated of the Doctor, and it just didn't fit with like everything else around it. So that was something that actually kind of broke my immersion a little bit, because the Doctor himself, I think, was probably the biggest problem with the art that I had. The rest of it looked kind of cohesive, but I think this is somebody that's comfortable doing like war comics. If you look at the other credits, it was like Vikings and, you know, Warhammer 40,000, something about the Space Marines fighting the orcs and, you know, stuff like that. So I think that he was probably picked for this story because they were doing like a World War I story, but his style didn't necessarily translate very well to like the sci-fi elements of Doctor Who. And yeah, like Tennant's face, there were some panels where it was good, and there were a lot of panels where he looked like maybe angry when I don't think that's what he was supposed to be emoting. So that was a little bit distracting as well. So yeah, this was one where, you know, generally the art will not like heavily impact my impression of a story, but it was definitely something that I noticed and that was distracting.
Same here. So I wanted to go back to one thing that you said before the art discussion, which was that you couldn't find any details on Indro online.
Oh, sure.
Did you realize that you made a Doctor Who joke when you said that?
No.
So you said he's basically like the John Smith of... So John Smith was an alias that the Doctor has used when he's like pretending to be human.
Of course it is.
Mr. Smith. So that was I was like, oh, that's a funny joke, and you just kept going. I was like, I don't think he knows that's a joke.
No idea. You are much more steeped in Doctor Who lore than I am, but you know what, if it works for the episode, I'm happy it happened.
Hey,
so.
There you go.
There you go.
So let's talk about the Doctor. And yes, this comic is called Doctor Who, but fans who are, or people who are not necessarily fans, may not realize that he is called the Doctor. He's not called Doctor Who. There's like sometimes where they kind of do it like an in joke where they're like Doctor Who, you know, just to be funny. But it's kind of like Star Trek, where it's called Star Trek, but nobody on the show says Star Trek except for that one, you know, kind of joke that they did
Cochrane.
on. Yeah. So, but they don't call it that. Anyway, so he's called the Doctor. His true name is unpronounceable by humans, so we're not even going to attempt that. He is a Time Lord from the planet Gallifrey. So his race are basically like caretakers of time and space. They also have this ability to regenerate their bodies when their current body is mortally wounded, where they gain a new physical form and even a new personality, which can be very startlingly different from the previous one. So even though he may look to be around 30 years old by human standards in the story, he's actually more like 900 years old. So just something to keep in mind as we go through this. They also, the Time Lords have a strict non-interference policy, which is kind of like the Prime Directive on Star Trek. But the Doctor is basically the Captain Kirk type character who willfully ignores the non-interference policy to, fight injustice and oppression and, just go break the rules and save people that maybe, should they be saved, should they not? He doesn't really wrestle with that. He just goes and rescues people. So, and like I said before, there have been various incarnations of the Doctor. Currently, we are looking at David Tennant actually coming back. So he was the 10th Doctor. He is going to be the 14th Doctor, which is an entirely different regeneration in the 60th anniversary this year, before we have another actor taking over as the 15th Doctor at the end of the specials, with his series starting in 2024. So we'll get into all the various different Doctors and how this came about in the after show, because the only Doctor we're concerned about with this story is the 10th Doctor, which again on TV is played by David Tennant. So the Doctor has a spaceship, and it is called the TARDIS, TARDIS, or Time and Relative Dimension in Space, which on the outside looks like a blue police call box, but actually is way bigger on the inside. And it's so big that the power source at the heart of the TARDIS is a singularity of an artificial black hole. So even though it looks like just a tiny box that like two people could stand in and like be bumping elbows, it's actually really big on the inside. So it also kind of has its own personality, and it takes the Doctor where he needs to be, or basically when we have a story that we want to tell, but it doesn't make sense why the Doctor would go here on purpose. That's kind of the writing shtick that they use to say, well, the TARDIS brought us here, so let's go check it out.
It's very Quantum Leap, isn't it? Like this is the point in time that I'm supposed to be at to fix whatever the problem is.
Yeah.
So,
and like they're like, oh, let's go to a green garden or a lush forest or something, and then they come out of the TARDIS and it's a desert, and it's like, did you put the wrong coordinates in? But the TARDIS decided, nope, this is where you need to be. So the Doctor often travels with a human counterpart, assistant, or companion that he deems intellectually worthy to explore the mysteries of, and puzzles of time and space. So there's been a lot of companions over the years, but our story today is featuring one called Gabrielle, or Gabby Gonzalez, who is an aspiring artist that met the Doctor and impressed him with her courage and creativity. So she is along for the ride. And so they use the term companion, but there really aren't any romantic relationships here. There's been a couple companions that like have tried to kind of do that, but the Doctor's 900 years old and he's really not about that at all. He's about the exploration and checking things out and that sort of thing. So there have been some jokes about that in the TV show, but so even though we use that word companion, it's more like a assistant or human counterpart or somebody to keep him grounded so he doesn't get all pompous about being a Time Lord, because the name is pretty pompous in itself.
Yeah, and I mean, as far as the TV show goes, it also gives them an opportunity to kind of bring in, not only will they bring in a new actor to play the Doctor every time he dies and regenerates, but they are allowed to switch out the companion as well, so the cast can kind of rotate the way it would on like, I don't know, like an anthology show like The Twilight Zone or something like that, except that it's one narrative. It's not like
and it's the same character, so the story can kind of just continue, but they can take it in different directions because he has a new personality, but he still has all the thoughts and memories of, all his previous incarnations. So it allows him, it sort of makes, why he's so clever a lot of the times too. So our antagonists in this story are the Weeping Angels, which on the surface look like ordinary statues, but when no one is looking at them, they can move around and prey on people by whisking them away into the past, feeding off the residual energy left behind them from all the loved ones or people they left behind in their current timeline. As they say in the episode, no mess, no fuss, they just zap you into the past and let you live to death. So they were first seen in the Doctor Who TV series in 2007, starring David Tennant as the 10th Doctor again, and also returned for 3 episodes, or I guess 2, it's a 2-parter and a standalone episode, during the 11th Doctor's tenure, starring Matt Smith, and then again on the 13th Doctor's tenure with Jodie Whittaker, and that version actually like gets transformed into a Weeping Angel, so there's a lot of weird things that they've done. Yeah. with these weeping angels. So I used to have a little miniature figure of one, and so I would place it in various places and cover its face, you know, and then I would move it periodically, and my wife got tired of it and she's like, this thing creeps me out and you keep moving it. So when we moved, I haven't been able to find it since, so I have a feeling that it went bye-bye. So yes.
That's very, very funny. I
Yeah.
wonder what moments like that I have in my future. I don't know, but
Well,
I don't
don't
think I
blink,
have
because
anything, yeah, too
either
creepy.
yeah, either the weeping angels are going to move and get you, or your wife's going to throw them away.
Right, exactly. So yeah, the Weeping Angels, I think I mentioned last time that they are one of the most terrifying things, maybe the most terrifying thing I've ever seen in Doctor Who. So just for everybody that's listening, so they know kind of where I'm at, I've seen Christopher Eccleston through Matt Smith, and then I believe I saw the movie where John Hurt was briefly the Doctor, and there was some sort of facsimile of Rose there, and I believe that's the last Doctor Who thing that I've seen.
And the
So
90s movie with Paul McGann, you saw that
oh
too.
yes, I did. I did see that. I
The
did
American version.
Yes. So weird. Yeah, so that's kind of like my knowledge, but I think as far as this story, I'm kind of okay because I've seen David Tennant and I've seen the Weeping Angels, so I kind of know what their deal is. But yeah, the idea that they like zap you back in time and then they feed off of all the potential of your life is pretty scary, and they also look terrifying. So be
Yeah.
ready for some pictures online that we'll be posting of that. But as far as our story today, it's one of those where it kind of begins already in progress, and we see a couple of Allied soldiers during World War I encountering the Weeping Angels. So shortly right after that, the Doctor and his latest companion, Gabriela Gonzalez, who we're just going to call Gabby from now on, arrive in the year 1914 in the middle of Mons, Belgium, which is currently undergoing a German shelling. And so, believing them to be Axis spies, they're captured by the Allied army, where they discover a German prisoner of war who has sewn his own eyes open and is screaming, "Don't blink." So right away, this is we're very much in horror territory. There is some of the Doctor's jokiness in his dialogue, but I would say that by and large, the like scary factor overwhelms the rest of this story, where that's kind of what you're signing up for. So the other major character that we have in this comic book story is Jamie Colquhoun, and I am not sure that I'm saying that correctly. He's Scottish, so that's probably not the correct pronunciation. But so anyway, they join up with I wrote down Colonel Corporal Jamie, and they're interrogated briefly while the Doctor tries desperately to convince the commanding officer that there are much worse dangers than the German army out there. And so, meanwhile, a couple of Scottish officers encounter the Angels and are swept back to the late 1800s, and they die on a collapsing train. So I guess that there was some sort of train collapse that went into the water and killed 100 people in 1879. I looked it up. Apparently it did happen. It's a real historical event. But yeah, so the Angels basically transported those guys back to like 5 minutes before they were going to die. And then, there you go. So that was good for me as somebody that has watched the shows like years ago, to get kind of a refresher of like, oh, okay, that's what they do. They like send them back in time, and then they die or they live out some alternate version of their lives. So the Doctor kind of explains at that point how they work. They devour the present and future of a victim while sending them into the past, allowing them to feed on their energy. And it's almost like they're feeding on the concept of the people's potential as well,
Yeah.
which is really kind of abstract, but that's what they're doing, which is actually a really important story point for later. So, of course, the Doctor is scarcely done explaining when he, Gabby, and Jamie are pinned in by the Angels. So, getting separated from the Doctor, Gabby and Jamie lose their friend Manny to one of the Angels. But instead of dying immediately, he instead saves a woman from getting murdered in the 1800s, marries her, and lives to be an old man up until the time when he was taken, which is really weird, but that's what happened. So meanwhile, Jamie plants a grenade in one of the angels' hands, but they keep coming. And in fact, they start to use like the smoke from the explosion to be able to move towards everyone without them seeing them, because basically they're completely inanimate, like they are statues, or they don't exist for all intents and purposes if you're looking at them. But the minute you blink, the minute you look away, they can move and they can, you know, come towards you. And so that, like, him throwing a grenade actually made it worse, because like, yeah, he blew off a chunk of it, but they couldn't see them in all the rubble. So then they start, you know, they start coming. There is a story point that happens here that I want to talk about later, so just keep it in the back of your mind. But there's also a military general on the English side that sacrifices himself for everybody at that point in order for the Doctor and Gabby and Jamie to get away. And that, you know, without getting too deep into it, that's something I feel like I've seen a lot on the show, is sort of like the NPC that we don't know and don't really care about, and he's the one that's going to make the sacrifice so our characters can get away, kind of thing. So just in time, right after that, one of their fallen comrades, Shuggy, who, again, I think he's one of the people from the prologue that was sent to the past, he shows up with a tank to rescue them from the angels. So he explains that while he was transported through time, he didn't die, and instead he married and had some children on a farm. And the Doctor discovers that the angels are starving, because this actually wasn't a great period in time for them to pick to get victims, because all of these people don't have a lot of potential life left ahead of them. Like, most of them were going to die in World War One. So because they were going to live such short lives, the angels aren't getting the sustenance that they need to feed on these people, basically. And one more shocking revelation towards the end of issue 3: the TARDIS isn't destroyed, but it's underground and in the hands of more weeping angels. So if you can imagine, kind of like No Man's Land, how they had like all the trenches dug and stuff during the war, and the people on both sides where you're just gaining like an inch a day or something like that. They had dug tunnels underneath all of that, and down there is where the TARDIS was, and the angels were, I guess, trying to keep them from it. I don't know. It was a little unclear what they were.
Yeah, there.
Like,
So that's another thing that happens in a lot of stories, is where they arrive somewhere and the TARDIS is inaccessible for whatever reason, and so they have to deal with whatever they're dealing with, and they have to get back to the TARDIS as well. But
right.
So since the TARDIS, or not the TARDIS, the Weeping Angels feed on time energy, basically, the TARDIS is like a buffet, and so is the Doctor. So if they were to consume them, it would keep them, you know, they could feed hundreds of thousands of them and they'd be full for a long time.
Okay. Well, I missed that when I missed their, like, what their intent was when I was going through it. But at any rate, the Doctor puts together some coat hangers and a whole bunch of other stuff to make a device that can track the TARDIS. And this sort of like budding romance thing starts to happen between Gabby and Jamie. So they go into the caverns under No Man's Land. Gabby and Jamie are separated from the Doctor. Jamie hatches a plan to blow up the tunnels using explosives that the Germans were going to use to blow them up, and take the angels with them, while the Doctor discovers that he can wink to evade the angels because he has one eye open long enough to enter the TARDIS. Meanwhile, a priest, who is actually a character that has been with them for a fair amount of the story, and the only other remaining survivor, actually, besides Jamie, Gabby, and the Doctor, stays behind and is touched by the angels and is transported to the moment of Jamie Culcohan's birth, oddly enough. So I don't know what relevance that really had to the story, but it was interesting. It was out there. So anyway, back in the 1900s, Jamie detonates the explosives, but he's rescued by the Doctor at the last minute. So our story ends with Jamie saying his goodbye to Gabby, and after the Doctor and Gabby depart via the TARDIS, we skip forward to 2007, where we see Jamie visiting a war memorial for his fallen comrades. And after a final touching moment, his great-granddaughter trips over a stone. a stone that just happens to look like a clawed hand. And that's where our story ends. So a very Twilight Zone or like horror movie kind of ending there.
Yeah. Well, this should be fun to talk about. But before we do that, I'm going to use my sonic screwdriver and adjust your frequencies to watch a clip from Doctor Who, and then we'll be right back.
They're coming. The angels are coming for you. But listen, your life could depend on this. Don't blink. Don't even blink. Blink and you're dead. They are fast, faster than you could believe. Don't turn your back. Don't look away. And don't blink.
All right, welcome back. Well, if you're not terrified by that, I don't know what will do it for you. So anyway, in our story today, we kind of talked about the TARDIS being famous for dropping the Doctor off, where he needs to be to save people. And it seems to also know what points in time are fixed versus ones where he's allowed to rescue people. But does it really seem like a good idea to drop him? Like, in these hostile situations where he has no idea what's going on, like in the trenches of World War I. Hey, where are we? This isn't where we wanted to be. Where are we? Boom! We're getting shot at. What's happening?
Yeah,
it's a war. Like, what?
So I wonder how much like intelligence it has about what it's doing, or if the TARDIS just thinks it's funny to do that or something. Because they are immediately at a disadvantage, and they're having to like convince people that they're not spies because they were on the German side and they were like running away from there. So obviously everybody's going to be like, who are you weirdos that look like you don't fit in? And then I think it's the general on the English side that's like, somebody's like, well, it's a beautiful woman and some well-dressed like foppish guy or something. He's like, I don't think that they're spies. And he's like, that's exactly how spies would look. They wouldn't look
that's
like
what
spies.
A spy would say.
I'm just like, oh my gosh, here we go. But yeah, it seems like they have to do a lot of extra work to sort of get everything moving and save lives in this one, because they're just like immediately in the middle of a war zone. So I don't know. The TARDIS has some kind of intelligence, doesn't it? I mean,
yeah. So it almost like it has its own consciousness, kind of, because of how it's powered. And there's actually an episode, I think it was with Matt Smith, where there was some planet they went to, and somehow the consciousness of the TARDIS was like made manifest into a human looking person. And she was like really crazy. And there's this line of dialogue where he's like, you're not exactly reliable. You never take me where I want to go. And she goes, but I always take you where you need to go. So they kind of, it's Doctor Who is like this, where it's like, it will get very sciencey, but the science is so far out there and fantastical that there's absolutely no way to explain it. Like having a tiny little box that's, bigger on the inside because of some kind of science that they do. Okay, it's a pocket dimension, whatever. But then as the show goes on, it gets bigger and bigger to where, it's powered by, an artificial black hole. And there's like a whole room where it's just this giant like galaxy inside of it. And like at some point, it just becomes so fantastical that it's like, okay, sure.
It's kind of the same argument, and I would think that it's more obvious for Star Wars than for Doctor Who, but I think it definitely falls more into that like science fantasy than or maybe just fantasy than science fiction. Like they have futuristic technology and they do time traveling, but the show is not really concerned with worrying about how any of that works, or it's all just in service of like, what adventure is the Doctor going to go on this week, and we don't really need to get caught up in the details of that. I think Star Trek is really the one where, for whatever reason, the fandom of that has just decided that they want everything spelled out explicitly, like as to how everything works. And even with the new shows, we get cranky when they don't do it, when they're like, this impossible device, like what, that just fixes everything, like where did that come from, how does it work, like why is this a thing we've never heard of before? Whereas in Doctor Who, I think you just kind of roll with it a little bit more, because that's kind of more the tone of the show. It doesn't really take the science stuff that seriously. And I think you had a note somewhere, I don't know if it's later on in here, but I had read it earlier, that Doctor Who is kind of a mix of comedy, sci-fi, and horror. And this story definitely focuses more on like the horror, and then there's a little bit of comedy. And I don't think there's the sci-fi element is really just that there's time travel involved, but that's always going to be involved in a Doctor Who story, because that's how he gets around.
Yeah.
Is by time traveling. So, you know, although I will say I found some points in the narrative to be a little bit harder to follow because there was so much jumping around. Like, okay, now this character's in the 1800s, and now this one's, you know, in an earlier time in the 1800s, and these people died on a train, and like, who is this guy again? And I don't know. It was a little difficult for me. But yeah, I guess to answer to like veer it back to the question, no, it doesn't seem like a good idea to just dump them in the trenches. I don't know how that was where he needed to be. It could have dropped him in like Allied headquarters or something in Belgium, and that would have been a lot better.
Yeah, outside the war zone, maybe, you know.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, it might have been better. Well, and the other thing too is like, it's very, you know, yeah, it's very fantastical, but like he can take, you know, a couple shoes and a coat hanger and, you know, sort of MacGyver some sort of device that does something that, you know, current science in real life has absolutely no explanation for, let alone how you could make it out of, you know, shoes and a coat hanger and that kind of thing. But yeah, to your point, you kind of just go with it because the Doctor, he comes from an advanced civilization that's far beyond, you know, anything that you know, we've seen or experienced. And so it's like they kind of have that leeway, but again, it's not about the science. Whereas, yeah, like on Star Trek, especially like Voyager, where it's very sort of ingrained in that science, although they take some leeways too, because they're like, oh, boost the gain. And, you know, they throw out like little terms here and there that's like, what are you actually doing? Oh, you're turning up the volume on the transporter signal? Well, okay, great. You know, that kind of thing. But and then Star Wars kind of being a little bit more in the middle, where it's like, well, we have a hyperdrive, which causes us to go light speed. And that's all you need to know. You know, that's what does it. We have engines, and even though we have this giant ship that has huge rockets on the back of it, somehow it can levitate in the, you know, in the atmosphere of a planet. Like it can lift off from a planet like this, even though the engines are huge, like the Star Destroyers. Yeah,
they look like they would just like drag the whole thing down. But
or it should just be like, you know, like a rocket ship. Or so, you know, it's kind of like that. Like you sort of just kind of have to accept it, you know, at some point like that. But yeah, being in the middle of World War I was not really good for them at first, but then they kind of like, you know, figured out what they needed to do, you know, getting there. And I like how, like, even in this comic, you know, the Doctor is being portrayed as like goofy on the outside, but also sharp and clever. So like in the, I think, first couple pages or maybe the second section of it, he's getting checked out because he got knocked unconscious. And so this Doctor is looking at him to figure out, you know, what's going on with this guy, and hears that he has two hearts, and it's like, whoa, what is this? Because that's a trademark of Time Lords, is they have two hearts. Right. And so there's like this thing where, you know, anytime somebody listens for a heartbeat on him, they're like, wait a minute, you have two hearts? Which I think there'd be a more plausible explanation, like there's something wrong with my scope, or there's some sort of like reverberation, rather than that being your conclusion. But anyway, the Doctor wakes up,
especially
and he starts
with what, you know, 19th century,
or
sorry, 20th century medicine, or early 20th century medicine.
You wouldn't just automatically be like, this guy has two hearts. You'd be like, oh, something's wrong here. But so the Doctor wakes up, he starts like doing his usual thing and talking out, and then he's like, hey, wait a minute, you're a doctor, but doesn't that collar mean that you're a priest? And like, I totally missed that. And so I went back a couple pages and looked, and I was like, oh, he does have a collar. How about that? So I thought it was really neat that, you know, the Doctor, like, he notices these things, and he catches these things that, you know, the audience takes for granted. And it's kind of like Ace Ventura, where he's like, I mean, not as far as Ace Ventura, because he's like way out there. That's maybe an extreme example, but where he's just like, oh, you're flailing around like an idiot. And then he makes a really good point, like, oh, everybody missed this. And, you know, he's the one that noticed it.
Yeah, it's funny how we keep coming back to that scene in that movie, but it's so kind of illustrative of like what we're talking about, though. Like, he's such a goofball on the outside. but he knows so much about everything that people
Yeah.
aren't really able to question him. Like, he knows things that he shouldn't know, and there's stuff going on with these angels, and like nobody else knows what's going on. So at least he has an explanation. So I guess people just are kind of like, I don't know, I guess we'll go along with it. Although
Yeah.
whoever the general was, I don't know, his name escapes me, really did not trust him at first and was just like, who is this guy? And like, what's he doing here? We have no reason to trust him. So that took a little while, which I think is maybe a little more realistic. But as is the case in, I think, the show as well, they really like speed through those moments quickly to like get to the story. So there's not usually a lot of like, well, I don't trust this guy, and like causing complications from that. It's usually more about like, well, we need to get to the core issue of like, what's the alien, or what's the thing that's plaguing this time period. So
there are some that like where they do kind of have that sort of power struggle, or the doctor's trying to tell them one thing and they want to go do something else. But usually what happens is the doctor is so confident and assertive because he knows what's going on and he knows what needs to be done in this situation. So when he gets into it, he just starts like, okay, you need to go here, you need to go there, we need to move this way. And people kind of just like start to go, okay, well, I guess this guy's in charge. So they sort of roll with it. But every once in a while, you do get the characters that put on the brakes and they're like, wait, who put you in charge? Why should we listen to you? Like, what makes you? And then usually it's got the psychic paper that, it's like basically a piece of paper that whatever somebody is thinking, it's another device that's like,
I totally forgot about
that. Whatever somebody's thinking and the right thing or whatever appears on the paper that you get, the person gets to see. And so he's like, here's my credentials. And it says, I'm the inspector, or, whatever it is. But we as the audience,
Division 6.
Yeah, like that. But we as the audience never get to see what's on the paper. And sometimes it says something that's really weird that even the doctor's like, wait, it says what? So it's not reliable either, but that makes it funnier.
Yeah, and I think this specifically is a story where the comedy needs to be there, because the angels are really terrifying. Like, they have these giant fangs in their mouths, and they have like claws that come out whenever they're coming after people. And of course it's like a freeze frame of them coming after you, because you never see them move, because you look at them and they stop moving. But it's a pretty scary idea. So I think it's good to have that, like, he's kind of able to break the tension, and that balances out the horror elements really nicely. I mean, there are a lot of horror movies that will go into like horror comedy or something like that to kind of, have a little bit of balance, so you're not just like relentlessly assaulting the audience with like terrible things all the time. This wasn't like that, where it was like, oh my gosh, like I just have to get out of this, like it's a downer. Like, it wasn't like that at all. It was more of like an adventure story. It's just that the thing that's chasing them is like really scary. So yeah.
So we've talked about the Doctor and the Weeping Angels quite a bit, but some of the other characters, like what did you think about Gabby Gonzalez as a companion? Did she seem like she contributed, or was she kind of just like bumbling along for the ride?
So I think she falls into the category of like Martha for me, where I'm like, she seems like a short-term fill-in kind of replacement character that doesn't really have a whole lot to her. Now, maybe if I had read previous issues, I would have more of an attachment to her, but I didn't find out she was an artist until the last issue of this collection, when she starts drawing. And she's not somebody that's shown up on the shows, right? So we don't have pre-existing knowledge of her from like a show, I don't think.
No.
And she's also, I did think it was unique that she's American, because I think she said she was from New York or something like that. And because she and Jamie are talking about that, and he's like, oh, I'd love to go to the Big Apple and all of this. So that actually was a very different angle that I don't know if I've seen them do that on the show. Actually, it's always like, people from the United Kingdom or like surrounding countries. So that part of it was kind of interesting to me. Like, oh wow, he actually has somebody that's not from that continent. But I don't know, she didn't really have a lot to do in this story. I didn't feel like the Doctor was basically driving the narrative, and she was there to, I don't know, maybe I guess kind of pull Jamie out of his shell a little bit, but that was really the main thing that she did in this story, other than just kind of tag along and occasionally be like, you're kind of a jerk sometimes, Doctor, that kind of a thing. So yeah, I don't know. I didn't think much about her like one way or the other, really.
Yeah, like and the part where she started doing her art was kind of like, I wasn't sure if it was supposed to be a synopsis of the story or like where that exactly fit, and I kind of would like that to have been, kind of more of a something for her to contribute in a way that was like unique to her character. Like the Doctor is not, he's very careful in who he chooses to allow to come with him on the TARDIS and experience these different moments in time. And usually he kind of like gives people a chance to sort of figure out what's going on. And it's funny because, sometimes they just don't have the information. Like there's no way you could guess what's going on if you've never heard of a weeping angel before.
No.
So it's not really fair. But, sometimes like as they travel with him longer, they start to kind of become more clever, and they start to see patterns and understand things and, kind of wager some guesses. But yeah, Gabby seemed like she was just sort of like along for the ride, and she did some art here in the middle, but it was kind of just like a throwaway, page or whatever.
She was kind of a blank slate as a character. I mean, there really just wasn't much to her, really. As far, I mean, they did give her a couple moments where towards the beginning, where she was kind of calling the Doctor out on like, you keep saying that we're going to visit like all these cool places, and then now we're in the middle of not only 1914, but in the middle of a war zone. Like, I don't think your TARDIS is doing a real great job. So like that kind of stuff was funny, but that was, it was such a minor component of the story.
Yeah.
I feel like I like the idea of her character, and I would like to learn more about her, but this story didn't communicate really much about that. So
yeah, which, I mean, what are you going to do when you're flung back into the 1910s and you're in the middle of a war and you have no idea what's going on, and there are these alien creatures killing people? I mean, what are you going to do about it when you're with the Doctor anyway? But still, like the companion usually is like the audience, so that way if the Doctor is going off on his crazy tangent, the companion person can be like, hey, stop, that doesn't make any sense, or hey, can you explain to me what just happened, or what are you doing? And then that gives him a chance to explain to the companion and also to the audience what's going on. So usually they're like a vehicle.
Agent Myers of the BPRD. the sort of audience insert character that's like, hey, what's going on?
What are we doing? What's a code? Whatever. And why is he eating that? And why is he grinding off his horns? And what's going on?
Right. All of that. Yeah. I mean, I guess she functions in that capacity, although he really needed to explain to everybody what was going on in this one, because there's a whole like military structure going on here, and like literally everyone is in danger. It was interesting to me. This might be jumping ahead a little bit, but I felt like the story was a little inconsistent, because at first the Doctor says, well, of course they would come here. There's people dying every day. It's really easy to like snatch them and nobody's going to notice and all of this. But then later he's like, this was a dumb idea for them to come here because these people have no potential lives. Most of them are going to die here. So I was thinking like, well, which is it? Like, which is it a good idea for them, or is it a bad idea for them? I felt like they kind of like went back on what he said earlier in the story. As far, I mean,
it would kind of be both, right? Because there's going to be survivors, but to them it might be hit or miss as to like, oh, I ate that one, and I only got like a couple years out of it. Darn. Oh, hey, I just got this one, and it was a long term survivor, so I'm good. Maybe just try again. And it's like hit or miss of what you're going to get.
I do have a question about that though. Did they have control over what point in time they send the people to, or is it just random?
So they don't really explain that, but there is an instance where, who was it? Somebody was sent, actually it happened a couple times, where somebody was sent to a certain time period by an angel, and then another person was sent to the same time period, and they concluded that it was the same angel that did it. So I don't know if that means like each angel has a different time period that they are tied to, and depending on who you get, you'll go to a different year. but it seemed like, at least for those instances, the same angel sent the two different people at two different times to the same time period.
Okay. Yeah.
And that's how Amy and Rory leave the show.
That's
is,
right. Yeah.
So he gets touched by an angel, but not in that sitcom way, but in the sent back to the past way. And so Amy does the same thing to go be with him, and they're together in the same time period.
Yeah, I remember that now. That was towards the end of like what I saw, I think, with Amy and Rory. And of course, Karen Gillan went on to have a very successful career elsewhere with cybernetic implants in her head. But yeah, so yeah, I guess I was a little unclear on how some of it works, but I guess there's not a lot of consistency to it. It's more like conjecture on the show as well. So I mean, that's fine.
Yeah, and it's not pure science. They again, it's the Doctor Who science where they kind of just like give you a little sprinkle and that's it.
Yeah, well, I just wondered because I was thinking, like, if they are able to pick where they send them to, wouldn't you want to send that person to a time where they're going to live a long time? Because can you then like feed on the potential of their, is it the potential of the life they would have lived, or is it the potential of the life that they get sent back to?
So I thought it was the potential of the life that they could have lived.
Okay, gotcha.
But so the Matt Smith a later episode, it's like Angels in Manhattan. So they're in Manhattan, and the angels actually like have this sort of asylum thing that they run, and they're everywhere. And so what they do is they trap people there, they feed on them, send them back, and then they live out their lives basically in these rooms, and they're locked in there for their entire life. That's actually the last episode with Amy and Rory, where Rory gets sent back originally, and we see him as an old man, and he basically lived and died in that bed from the time that he was sent back to the present time, when he's like got the old man makeup on, and he's like looks like he's like 150 years old.
That is horrifying.
It was and in that episode, the Statue of Liberty was a weeping angel too. So
that's right.
It was a very terrifying episode because they're like,
not about that.
What is that noise? What is that sound? It sounds like Godzilla or something. And then the Statue of Liberty is like right there. That was fun.
Yeah, it's a pretty, whichever one of the Doctor Who writers came up with it, it's a pretty scary idea.
The Weeping Angels are an interesting foe because the more that you use them, the kind of less scary that they get, especially for audience members, because it's like, okay, they can only do one thing. It's you blink and you're dead, but if you keep your eyes open, then you're okay. So all you have to do is not blink, which is, easier than it sounds. So there's not really like, you can't really break new ground with them. All you can do is kind of involve them in a story where something else is going on, because they're just going to do the same thing that they do. Now, it was cool because after the original episode, when we see them again with Matt Smith in the two-parter, they introduced the concept that the image of an angel is also an angel. So they have a video where they captured video of an angel, and that became like quantum lock to the original angel. So as long as that original angel was in existence, that image that was on the video actually was a real angel, and it was like coming out of the screen. And then it actually lodged itself in Amy's mind, like in her mind's eye kind of thing, because that was the other concept that they introduced, is if you stare into its eyes for too long, it like burns itself onto your retina. And so then that is an actual angel. And it was like in her head, and she had to keep her eyes closed. Otherwise it was going to like come out of her head or something. So it's like, the more
they have to keep introducing new layers to it.
I did like the layer that they added in this story, which was, where he goes, don't blink, wink, blink and you're gone, but wink and I can keep one eye on you all the time. So Amy actually does that when she's watching the video. She's like trying to keep her eyes open, and she kind of like squints one a little bit, but they never talk about winking. And as far as I know, this comic is the only place that they do that. So I thought that was cool that they actually did introduce something that was helpful without changing, the lore of the Weeping Angels.
Yeah, I definitely think that it's one of those things like the Borg, where the first time you see the Borg on the Next Generation, they have like decimated an entire planet. They come on board the Enterprise and they can't be reasoned with. They're just assimilating stuff. And Q is like, this is what waits for you out in space. Like, you're not ready for it. I'm telling you, you are not ready. And lo and behold, when the Borg actually do get there, they're not ready, and they seemed really terrifying on the Next Generation. But then you get to Voyager, and the first thing they do with them is introduce something that's more powerful than the Borg that can destroy them. And then they do a lot of stuff where we learn more and more and more and more about them. And especially with like scary stuff, I think the more you learn about it, like the less frightening it is. So it is one of those things where they go back to that well so often that eventually you're just like, all right, well, it's going to be a Borg episode, but you're kind of settled in for like, I kind of know what to expect from a Borg episode. Like, here are the things that they do, and and I think that Brandon Braga and some of the other writers found ways to give it like unique twists. Like, Seven goes to Unimatrix Zero in this one, which is like a place she can go when she dreams, where she meets other people that they have their individuality like while they dream or something. And I mean, but they're really like reaching into that well for like crazy ideas to kind of do something new with them. So
yeah,
I think the Angels are the same way, where it's one of those where maybe less is more. Like, we don't need to see them like all the time, because then you do kind of get to where you're like, all right, it's another Angel episode, so they're not going to be able to blink, and that's their thing. You get kind of desensitized to it after a while.
right, exactly. Yeah, and so you
yeah.
have to come up with crazy ways to change them. But if you change them too much, then they are departed from the original concept, and then they're not even the same characters anymore.
Right.
So yeah, it's something that if you overuse it, and it's interesting too, because like with the sort of horror aspects, it's a lot scarier, especially in their original episode, than in the comic. Because when you're reading the comic, you kind of like, oh, the characters are in danger and they're scary looking and whatever.
Yeah.
But in the episode, it's like, especially the way that episode was done, where it's not from the Doctor's perspective. He's removed from it, and we are with some person that we've never met before, that we'll never see again because she was only in this one episode, and seeing it from her perspective, and the Angels creeping. But then they have they use the typical kind of piano strings where they like hit a hammer, or they use a bow to like go across them, and it's like this sound when they appear, and then there's this like whooshing sound and all the sound effects, and then the music with the like high frets on the violin, or just like the squeaky like horror sounds, and it's very creepy when you watch the show. But when you take something that's creepy and you put it into a comic, it's really hard to capture that creep factor.
Yeah, to capture that atmosphere. I think that there are artists that are capable of it, and I think that there are storytellers that are capable of it. I know, just off the top of my head, Scott Snyder, who wrote Batman for a long time, and for DC, he did a lot of sort of independent like horror stuff for Image before that. He did a book called Severed that is pretty terrifying. However, it's all in sort of like the anticipation of what's going to happen off panel. It's not so much in what they actually show you. It's more about like, you're worried about this character, and like, is that thing going to get him? Like, I don't know. Like, it's much more of the anticipatory stuff, which is funny because comics are a visual medium. So you would think, oh, show more of it. But really, I think for scary stuff, especially, a lot of times, if you can leave more to your audience's imagination, it's going to be a little bit more effective. So I think the problem with translating the Angels to a 2D still format is that their whole thing of them not moving doesn't feel novel, because nothing moves on the page. So it's kind of like, you can't, how do you convey that really? You just have to keep cutting to like another panel of where it's like a little bit closer to them and stuff like that. But I think that's really hard to show visually. So, I mean, we kind of were crapping on the artist a little bit at the beginning, but that aspect of it definitely would have been really hard to, I mean, I don't know how I would approach that issue if I were penciling necessarily. So
yeah, really hard to get that same sort of like
Mhm.
feeling of dread when, like you said, nothing on the page moves. So if you're not even familiar with the Weeping Angels and you pick this up, are you really going to understand the concept that they only move when you are, you know, you're not looking at it, or your eyes
Right.
are closed when you blink or something? And you know, to be able to see that, maybe with some like kind of perspectives where you sort of see the character, and then in the next panel it's like, you know,
Mhm.
very much closer. You'd have to kind of
Mhm.
do it in maybe an extreme way rather
Yeah.
than like little increments, whereas on the show little increments was really creepy, because it's like, wait a minute, you know, because first you see it like this, and
Yeah.
then you see it like this, and then you see it like this, and then you
Right.
see it like this, like it's incrementally, like slowly moving,
Yeah.
whereas when you do that in the comic, it's like, okay,
Yeah,
it's getting
that's
closer,
how
run.
sequential storytelling in comics works. So it's not
Right.
like, it's not terrifying. It feels more like you're just watching it move naturally when you're reading it on a page. So
Hmm.
I will say one thing that, and so I'm not somebody that cares a ton about graphics all the time in video games, but when it comes to TV shows and movies, I want the CGI or the production quality to look good enough that it's going to convince me that these live action people are in that environment. That's a place where I really care about it. And I hate to say that, but like the low production value of like the first couple seasons of Doctor Who that I watched really made it difficult for me to get through. Like whenever they had like a bajillion Daleks on the screen, like in space, and I was just like, it looks so fake, and I don't know. Like, so I will say that's points in the favor of it being a comic book, because it doesn't cost money to put 500 angels on a page. It just costs the time that it takes to draw it. So that was kind of nice, where everything looks consistently like the same world, you know, because
Mm.
it's all being drawn by the same penciler, as opposed to, you know, having CGI elements that maybe weren't green screened out as well as they could be, or things like that. And I mean, we had a whole discussion last week on how unacceptable that is in 2023. I think it's a
Yeah.
lot more forgivable in the early 2000s when that was kind of, you know, getting
Being
going.
developed. Hmm.
But I've been very spoiled with growing up watching so much Trek that I was just like, you know, okay, I have to like recalibrate a little bit and sort of suspend my disbelief a little bit, because I know like what they're trying to show with the visuals, but sometimes it wasn't quite making it there. And I think by the time Matt Smith came on, I felt like they were really like, you know, cranking out some top-notch effects, but it kind of took them a while to get it rolling.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's an element that the comic book I think does better than the show, because again, there's no having to marry digital and traditional elements together. It's just all one thing.
I
So
think all the Weeping Angels were all practical effects. I don't know that
yeah,
they ever
so they
used.
looked good. Uh-huh.
Yeah. I don't know that they ever used CGI for those. I do know
Mm-hmm.
that they used, rather than make a whole bunch of statues in different poses, they actually
Mm-hmm.
put like statue-like makeup on people and had them, you know, hold poses. Because I remember
That's
seeing like one
smart.
or two shots where like, I think that person is breathing, or, you know, like maybe they move just a little bit. And those kind of things take you out of it. I mean,
Yeah,
it's hard to be perfect with those kind of things, but it
sure.
definitely, as an audience member, takes you out of it. But there's a part where Amy is she's got the angel in her mind, so she has to keep her eyes closed, and so the
Mm-hmm.
angels are kind of running on instinct because they're all panicking, running away from the danger that's in this episode, which is actually not them, it's something else. Well, it's kind of
Right.
them, but anyway, so they're running away, and so they go past her, and they don't realize that they can't see her, so they kind of like stop, and then they're like, wait a minute, she's stumbling around, can she not see? And so you see one of the angels, and she's got this, like, it looks like a still statue face, so they did a really good job on the like plaster or whatever they put on
Mm-hmm.
them, but the angel's like this, and it just goes and there's a scraping stone sound, and I'm like, oh dang, this is creepy. That was a
Yeah,
lot of
I
fun.
guess that's another thing that this concept really is hard. I mean, the more we're talking about it, I'm realizing like how much you're missing by not having sound effects
Yeah.
and, you know, music and things like that. And normally I think comics are able to excel at maybe not the same things as movies, but they're able to tell a really cinematic story a lot of times. But this specific idea just seems like you can't quite get there with just drawing it and having it be prose on a page.
So with all the science fiction that we've kind of been talking about, we've obviously brought up Star Trek a lot. We brought up Star Wars a little bit. We haven't really talked about Babylon 5, though there is some time travel in that as well. But all these sci-fi shows that we've watched, how does the concept specifically for the Weeping Angels, stealing your potential future by sending you to the past, compare with other time travel tales? Or is this something that's, unique to these characters?
So it's funny because before I read this story and saw that question, I was looking through the notes yesterday and I saw that question and I was like, yeah, the Weeping Angels are pretty unique. And then I was like, oh, except for that one episode of Next Generation where the Davidians go back in time and they're stealing life energy from people by making it look like they have the Black Plague. That's a whole thing that happens on Star Trek TNG. The aliens are literally feeding off of the life force of like people that society won't miss. The Enterprise has to go back in time. That's when they meet Mark Twain. All of that kind of happens. So it's not the same exactly. They're not feeding off their potential life or whatever. It's more that they're like draining their neural energy or something like that. But the idea of aliens going back in time to find a time when a bunch of people were dying and then using that as like a cover to do their thing, I was like, oh, wow, they actually did that on The Next Generation. So that never occurred to me before because mostly I think the way the Angels operate, first of all, is way creepier. And the creepiest thing the Davidians had was like that snake staff or something. I don't know. But I was thinking about it specifically because I saw this question in there. So
okay. So it's interesting too, because the Angels don't have to feed on people. Like they show, like, obviously they want the TARDIS because of all of its time energy. They want the Doctor, and they've used this concept with other things too that like feed on time energy, and the Doctor being like a, not just a tasty snack, but like with his 900 years of time travel, is a very meaty morsel. But what I was going to say,
ripping off the bone.
Exactly. But like there's alternate ways that they can get it rather than from people. So like in the Matt Smith episode, there's this crack in time that keeps, not kraken, but crack in time that keeps following them because of what's, the overall story in that season or series. If you're in the UK, they call it series instead of season, whereas we call it season.
To be fair, you're talking about Doctor Who and not Ratchet and Clank, A Crack in Time.
Yes, not a crack in time, gotcha. Ratchet and Clank, not a crack in time, but there is a crack in time. Oh boy. Anyway, so there's time energy spilling out of it. And so these angels, and it's really, really creepy in the episode too, because there are these like deformed statues that are supposedly the remains of this ancient civilization. And then they're actually not, they're angels who've been starved to death. And so as they start feeding on this crack in time in Doctor Who, they start actually turning into angels, and it's really freaky. But they're feeding off of that instead of off of people. So I kind of wonder, like, okay, so isn't there a way, an alternative way, a more humane way than, sending people back in time to get what they need to survive? Or is it just there's so many of them and they're not really organized in the sense of, they don't have a governmental structure, they don't have an economy. It's literally just, let's get together, go out there and, fling some people into the past so we can feed, just as simple as that. But there might be other ways that they could, get what they need that wouldn't hurt, but there's no reasoning with them. There's no like, hey, can you hold on a scotch for just a moment? Whatever. It's just like, it sees you, and as soon as you blink, you're gone.
Yeah. I think the Doctor described them in this story as like nature's most perfect predators or something. So, I mean, I still believe that that's the xenomorph from the Alien movies, but these are pretty close. So
yeah,
when you have a mouth inside of your mouth,
then you know it's
also a mouth.
You mean business. And
So,
when your blood is acid,
right,
and when someone cuts you and they get burned from your acid blood, that's
right.
pretty
It's pretty bad
for you.
Yeah. So I guess there's a couple more things that I sort of wanted to touch on really briefly. The winking thing, you had written down something about how you liked that.
Yeah.
I can kind of go either way on it. I was kind of like, oh, is that really all you have to do? Though, because then that to me takes a lot of the gas out of their scariness. If all anybody has to do is keep alternating which eye is open, and it makes sense. It totally makes sense within the lore.
It's a lot easier than blinking.
I was just like, that's all they had to do all this time. Like all those episodes, they just had to wink and they would have been fine. It's like, no problem. You can get out of there. So I don't know. It felt like, I keep going back to Star Trek, and I'm sorry, but those are the examples that come to mind. Sure. You know, grabbing Grandpa Borg's chin tube and pulling it out, and that's all you have to do to kill him. You know,
yeah.
That kind of a thing, where later on they were like, well, we have a bajillion of these guys, so our characters have to be able to take them out quickly. I was like, that's how he's going to get through. At the same time, I'm glad it was the Doctor and not somebody else, because I'm glad to see that, like, he should be the smartest person in the room wherever they go. So I'm glad that he was the one that like thought of that, like, oh yeah, no problem. I just, wink. And
yes.
So yeah, but I don't think I was quite as positive on it as you, just because I felt like it really took the urgency out of that part of the story. So
yeah, and that's always the thing, right? It's like they can't move as long as you can look at them. So if you have one angel and 5 people, then it's really not a threat. It's when you have like 50 angels and 5 people that, it's more of an issue. But like so in one of the episodes, there are these guys who are part of this, it's like some futuristic where the church and the military are now the same organization, and they're like a church military, whatever, not church mafia, but church military. Anyway, so they are like trying to keep the angels at bay, and they're sneaking through this forest to come and, to get everybody.
And so it's like, I remember that. Yeah.
You have everybody like kind of posted, and you have the angels who are like sneaking behind the trees to, get them. And it's like, these guys all have their backs to each other and they're all looking out. So the angels can't approach them, because as long as they're watching and they're not blinking, there's nothing the angels can do. Like there's no way around it. There's no cheating the system. All they can do is they seem to have an ability to knock the lights out, or the torches, which is what they call flashlights.
That happens in this story too, doesn't it? Isn't there a part where they like knock out the lights in one of the buildings?
I think so. But like in the show, it's really creepy, because like the lights start to flicker and they're like, what are they doing? And you see one of the angels doing this, pointing at the light bulb, and you're like, oh. And in the episode with Angels in Manhattan, there are these like little cherubs that are also like of the Weeping Angels variety. And so Rory has a match, and so he lights a match, and when he holds it up, you see one of the little cherubs going like this, and then he blows out the match, and now it's dark again. So it's like, again, with the kind of creep factor, they could have done more, I think, with the lights. Maybe that would have been a way to make the comic seem creepier, is like when we as the audience can't see what's happening, it's like, oh no.
And they had a lot of chase sequences with running away from the angels and trying to keep an eye on them and stuff like that. But it felt more like an action adventure thing than like, where it's like, well, they're going to get away. I feel like they're going to get away and it's going to be fine. And I didn't feel like that real sense of suspense, except for, of course, the characters that they are able to kill, like the General Fairbairn or whatever, that at one point is just like, you guys go on, I'll stay here. And he like recites his whole family history while he's like blasting a pistol at the angels, which of course does less than nothing. That moment, I swear they have done something identical to that. And it might have been in the Are You My Mummy episode that was like early with the kids in the gas masks or whatever. But I swear there's been an episode of Doctor Who that I've seen where they were with like a military group, and it was World War I or II, and they were running away, and there was like a general that was like, I'll stay behind and protect you, and they're just like, no, we can't let you do that, but actually we can, because you're only hired for this one episode, so it's fine.
Well, it could have been the one with the forest, the two-parter, because so the guy who's in command, the head cleric or priest or whatever, is telling the doctor, you need to get out of here, and the doctor's like, no, I'm not leaving. And then the lights flicker, and then all of a sudden there's an angel who's holding him, because the angels, since they were already feeding on this energy, they didn't need the people, so they were just killing him.
Oh wow.
And so they got him like by the neck, and he's like, go save yourself, I'm done, but it's okay, because my father was a something, and I held my honor to the last, and I'll save you, and it's okay, when he was kind of like dissing the doctor throughout the episode. So it was kind of like, okay, now you're going to make the noble sacrifice or whatever. But that was Ian Glenn, who plays Bruce Wayne on the Titans show on Max. So it's kind of funny.
You know who else he plays? I believe Dr. Isaacs in Resident Evil 2 and 3, the movies.
Really?
He turns into a horrible nemesis, or not nemesis, but like a horrible thing at the end of the third movie. Yeah. But
fun.
That's what I know him from. So,
okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was funny because he was in that episode, and he's the one who gets choked out by the angel at the end. But yeah, he's the head guy who basically was dissing the doctor, and then at the end, when he's faced with death, he's like, go on, get out of here, I'm going to sacrifice myself for you, and it's okay, and whatever. And it's like, yeah, you were just hired for this one episode, so it's okay, bye-bye.
Yeah, that's kind of how it felt with Fairbairn, because he was kind of an impediment in the Doctor's path for this whole comic. And then they get to the end where they're all in trouble, and he's like, I'll go out nobly. And I'm like, all right, I guess that's your like redemption arc. But it felt like kind of a very like stock thing to do, I guess.
Well, and it's funny too, because like we get these stories where they take place between continuity that we've already seen somewhere else, and certain characters have to survive the story because they go on to do other things.
Right.
So it's like they have to introduce characters that are expendable, because there are certain ones that they absolutely cannot kill. Like when you're watching the animated Clone Wars, you can't kill Anakin Skywalker there, because he has to be, in the third movie and become Darth Vader and all that stuff. And you radically, destroy stuff. Like when you're watching the Star Trek 2009 reboot, that's a little bit different, because they said that was an alternate universe. So they really could kill Kirk, Spock, or, somebody off if they wanted to, and they could kind of make that work. But then when you're watching like Strange New Worlds, there's certain things that they can't do, because canon's already established after that point. So we know certain characters that are going to survive. And for the ones where we don't know if they survive or not, then they're expendable because for the story.
It's like Spock having the relationship with T'Pring. It's like, well, we know for a fact that this is going to end during the original series, because he goes back to Vulcan, and T'Pring is like, I found somebody else, so I found a reason for you to fight for my honor to get through Ponfar, and now I'm going to leave with this guy. And that's basically what happens in Amok Time. So we know that relationship can't go anywhere on Strange New Worlds, because canon has already been established. So yeah, it's very much like that. I think that the story does a decent enough job of feeling like this is just another adventure that the 10th Doctor went on with a different companion. I'm a little unclear where it fits, because did he have Rose at first, and then he goes to Martha, and then was
Donna Noble?
Donna Noble was his companion for a while?
There was space in between.
There was? Okay.
So it's not like, there was one exiting as one came right in. And even if it was like back-to-back episodes, I mean, what happened in between those episodes?
Sure. Okay.
And him being, time travel is involved, and he's hundreds of years old. So, I mean, there are going to be gaps in what happens on screen versus off screen where these kinds of stories can take place.
Yeah, I can accept that. I think.
Because there's like a couple TV movies too that do this sort of thing where we have a companion that we've never heard of, that we'll never hear of again, and is really just featured in that one, TV movie or whatever.
Yeah, wasn't it like Kylie Minogue in one of them or something? It was some.
Yeah, they went through like a portal or something.
Yeah,
and she seemed like she'd be a really cool companion too.
I know. I was like, this is so strange.
Well, anything else before we move to final thoughts?
I think I am good.
All right. Get ready for final thoughts and try not to blink. All right, we are back, and we did not blink the whole time.
Because I sewed my eyelids open like that German soldier.
I'm just going to wink. That's much easier than
everybody
sewing your eyelids
watching
open.
the video podcast on YouTube. Make sure to look for my eyes sewed open.
You can see the whites of our eyes.
And
the Mike whites of our eyes.
With my glasses, I've got some shadows going on.
I got a fan going, and my eyes are getting dry holding them open.
Yeah, so. I know. I don't know how to do it. Yeah, it's funny. There was a point where Gabby was talking in the story about like, I used to have staring contests with my brother, and I was really good. And then it goes on for a little bit too long, and tears start to come out. And I was like, yeah, you can't do that forever. Like,
she's like, he had a much shorter attention span because he was really young. So they didn't last very long. That was funny.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's really hard to like consciously not blink for an extended period of time, especially when, like I said, I got a fan on me, but if the wind's blowing or whatever, like your eyes just start to dry out after a while. And you're like, I can't do it.
It gets uncomfortable pretty quick. So,
but if there's a weeping angel in front of you, probably, gives you a little adrenaline that helps you, keep your eyes open, because don't blink and you're dead. But anyway, we should talk about our final thoughts. So I think you went first last time.
I went first last time. You go ahead.
So it's funny because like when we review these comics where one or even both of us, but in this case me, is a huge fan of whatever it is that we're reviewing, like in the video version here. So I have the backdrop of the TARDIS behind me. I have various props. I've got a TARDIS. I've got a little David Tennant Doctor Who ornament that I've got next to the TARDIS. I've got the shoes and the glasses, and I have an outfit on, and like I have all this stuff, and you're like, okay, this guy's a Doctor Who nut, so they're reviewing a Doctor Who comic. So he's probably going to give it the highest score because he loves everything that's Doctor Who. And it's funny too, like to choose a story and then rate it and then be like, well, I love Doctor Who and I love all this stuff, but this comic is just not, it colors your perspective on how to rate something. So I guess I say all of that to say, like, I always have these disclaimers when I rate stuff, because I'm like, it's either my personal experience or I'm totally giving you a biased review because I just like to read Doctor Who and I like to watch Doctor Who. So of course I like it.
Well, and I think also it's important to note that like you are such a big fan of the property coming into this. So you're not going to be able to look at it from a like, I'm just picking this comic up off the shelf. But I also don't think that's the audience it's intended for. I think it's intended for the person that's like, I'm already in, I want to read more adventures about this guy.
Yeah. So they didn't give us anything in here where they didn't really explain who the Doctor was and where he came from and what the TARDIS is and all the background that we gave you. You don't get that reading this comic. So if this is something that, you're not really familiar with and you pick this up, you might be a little bit lost, although hopefully after listening to our episode, it'll make a lot more sense. And maybe you're a crazy diehard fan now. So, hey, have fun with that. But anyway,
hopefully so.
Yeah. So I did have some critiques of this, which the art I wasn't a huge fan of. The inconsistencies in drawing sort of took me out of it. And I really felt like the Weeping Angels, there's got to be a way to convey them in this type of media that make them look a lot creepier than they did, but it was really more of just like a story that they told. But I did like the fact that it wasn't just a carbon copy of what we've done on the TV show. It was different enough that it felt like it was its own story. It did its own thing. It was a side adventure, and it was sort of like a part of the lore that it contributed to, rather than just be a rehash of every Angels episode that we've ever seen. So
Sure.
I think I'm going to be favorable to this one and give it a 4 out of 5 bananas,
Okay.
because of those things that I liked. It's really, I could probably knock it a little bit and give it like a 3.75, you know, just to critique it a little bit. But I think, you know, just my enjoyment of Doctor Who overall is just going to secure it at that 4 level.
Okay. That makes sense. So I think I've explained a little bit where I'm coming from with Doctor Who before too. And the production value of the show, again, it's one of those things that is so surface level, and I know that it should not bother me, but it does. There are times where I would have trouble watching it, especially in the Christopher Eccleston year, where I was like, oof, this looks really fake, you know, and it would just take me out of it. And I think that my expectations going into it were not what it actually is. I was expecting it to be more of a sci-fi show, and what I got was more of this like comedy, horror, sci-fi kind of like smorgasbord,
fantasy,
and fantasy as well. And I think my tendency was to, again, and I've said this many times, because I hate fun, I want it to take itself a little more seriously than it does. I think there's so many concepts, and kind of how you reacted to like the sci-fi elements being kind of undercooked in Dimension Z. I feel that way about a lot of the Angel stuff. Like, I really want to know the intricacies of like, how does that work? Why does this one send that guy to 1879, and why does this one send him to 1892? And you know, what is there any kind of like order to what they do? Is it just instinctual? Like I want more like explanation on what they do and kind of what drives them. And I realize that probably would make them less scary, but they're interesting enough as a story idea that I'm like, just tell me more. Like, I want to know more about them, you know? Like, they seem like a cool, like interesting race. And there's such a unique concept that's like just on this show that I wouldn't be opposed to getting more of like a deep dive into them.
yeah.
So you know, so again, I had to preface by saying I'm not a hardcore Doctor Who fan. My favorite Doctor was Matt Smith. It had a lot to do with bringing in Amy and Rory.
Out of the 3 that you watched,
Yes, of the 3 that I watched, I only saw Eccleston, Tennant, and Smith. So yeah, again, I'm not really qualified to make a judgment there, but of the 3 that I watched, Matt Smith was my favorite. I really liked how just completely, totally different he was from the 2 that came before him. I really, I don't know. I think he embodied the character in a way that really kind of spoke to me, and I was like,
sure,
all right, I can kind of like get with this. And I think having the dual companions really helped the show, as far as like having more than one perspective for him to bounce off of. And that also meant that they kind of like totally removed that romantic angle, where like he didn't have to, you know, you don't have to. I mean, there was a little bit of that, but mostly Amy was like with Rory, and they were kind of, you know, doing their own thing. So and I realize that's not a popular opinion. I know most people prefer Tennant. He's kind of like the favorite, but I think I'm going to give this a 3. And I think it's largely, it's not, I want to say it's not because of my bias, but I put all that out there just in case that affected it, because there are just a lot of things that pulled it down for me. I felt like some of the story beats, like the guy sacrificing himself for them, I was like, that's kind of like a stock thing that they do. Gabby really wasn't, she didn't have like a lot of life to her, and I kind of wanted somebody for him to play off of a little bit more, because that's a lot of the fun of the show for me, is seeing how he bounces off of like other people, and how he comes into a situation and they're just like, who is this guy? Like, what is he doing? And so I kind of was looking for more of that, and it seemed like they were more focused on like, let's get to the next chase scene and the next action sequence, and you know, let's throw grenades and shoot guns at them and do all this stuff. And it's like, that's very visual in a comic book, but it didn't really do a lot to like move the story forward. So I felt like yeah, I think a 3 is where I'm going to land on it. 3 bananas, just because I felt like there was a lot of potential there, but they didn't quite realize it, and it didn't quite break out of like, oh, this is kind of just like a stock Doctor Who thing for me. Like I was looking for a little bit more, I don't know, something. I can't put my finger on what it is, but I was just looking for a little bit more in it. So
it was kind of like a little mini adventure, but if they had made this maybe 10 issues and really took the time to flush out the story, we could have had maybe some more less actiony moments and more focused on, like, you know, maybe Gabby asking, okay, what are with these angels? And she starts to draw one, and the Doctor takes it and rips it up and says, no, don't draw it. Like, don't you understand?
That's a great story idea right there, because she's an artist. So that would be, there had to be some way to like play into her character traits to involve her in the story more. And I also felt like all the soldiers that we got to know, it was just like you meet them and then boom, they're sent back to this point in time. And then they live out like this other life, but you're kind of like, well, I don't know who they were anyway. So I don't really know that it's that, like, I don't know how different that is. So it was hard to connect with some of them, you know, as far as that went. And I wasn't sure if I was supposed to be like feeling something for them, or if it was just to kind of show us like, well, this is what they do. They take them back in time and sort of visually being like, this is how it plays out. So I don't know. I think it was a competent story, but it wasn't one where I was like, oh man, I need to read more Doctor Who stuff by this author. It was just kind of like, yeah, it was, you know, it was fine. So I think 3 is the fairest score I can give it. So yeah, that's going to average to a 3.5 though. So that's not a bad score.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, everybody, tell us what you think of this comic by posting on social media at Boneless Comics 1 on Twitter and at Boneless Comics Podcast pretty much everywhere else. And be sure to use the hashtag Boneless Comics Podcast.
That's right. So we're going to stay away from the big 2 for a little bit longer, and we're actually going to go read some manga. So we're going to actually go back to the world of Nier to discuss the first volume of Yorha Pearl Harbor Descent Record, which was published in December 22, which is set before the events of the video game Nier Automata, or Automata, however you want to say it, that came out in 2017, which is a sequel from the far distant future of the Nier Gestalt, or Replicant, that we reviewed actually last November. So the first volume of this manga actually came out a month after we did our review of Nier Gestalt and Replicant. So kind of cool. Anyway, make sure you watch that or listen to that episode before you go to the next episode. But make sure you tune in to YouTube for the after show.
That's right, everybody. Thank you so much for listening, and stay away from Weeping Angels.
That's right. Peace.
Don't blink. If you're shining a light in my eyes, so I have to blink.